I'd like to welcome everyone. My name's Robert Cervelli. I'm one of the co-founders of Transition Bay St. Margaret's. I'd like to welcome everybody this evening. We're going to get started here. This is a 90-minute workshop on seed saving start to finish. Very good topic for this time of year. I do want to ask everyone to stay on mute if you can, you know, because of all the little background noises, if your dog barks or, you know, whatever it might be. And that way the screen will stay on who's speaking and there'll be much less interruption. We are recording this event both on Zoom and it is being live streamed to Facebook as well. Just so you know, we would like to ask that you can hold questions to the end, or you can type them into the chat box. And we're hoping to have a good long discussion period at the end of the presentation. So I would like to start out just to say a little bit about Transition Bay. We were founded, I believe it's now 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago. We're one of the more active transition groups in Eastern Canada. It's part of the international transition movement that came out of England in 2005, and it's pretty well gone viral around the world. I think there's some 90 to 100 transition initiatives just in Canada alone. And the whole idea of the transition movement is it's building local resilience at the community level so the communities can be more buffered against all the global changes that are taking place, particularly around energy, the environment, and the economy. So that's what we do. We have a whole lot of different projects that we do. Go to our website, check things out, get on our mailing list so you'll know and be current with what's going on. We're always looking for volunteers, so don't hesitate to let us know. And of course, donations for events like this are greatly appreciated. There's a donation button on our website. And you'll see a lot of the great events that we've done. This is an example of one of them around seed savings. So we tend to focus on food, a lot of projects related to food and food production. We get into things like off-grid, upskilling, a whole lot of other topics with different types of events that we do over the course of the year. So what I'd like to do at this point is introduce our main speaker tonight and tell you a little bit about them. This is, it's Chris and oh, Chris, I'm trying to find your last name and I apologize for that. Stinton, no, I'm sorry.
Sanford.
Say that again?
Sanford.
Thank you very much, Chris, and I'm sorry about that. Chris Sanford, she and her partner Garrett and their two daughters, Ruth and Joyce, they work a heritage homestead in Lunenburg County. They've been at it for quite a few years now, and they grow over 150 varieties of vegetables, grain, flower, and herb seeds. Everything they sell, they produce themselves on their farm. So an incredible depth of experience in seed production and everything that's involved. Had a fascinating discussion with Chris as we were prepping for this. Just even, for example, Tanque Island cabbage, which is a favorite, long-standing local heritage variety, and just everything you've got to do to produce cabbage seed. It was quite fascinating. I think we're going to learn about this, and I think we've learned since COVID came about last spring, the huge interest in gardening, huge interest in seeds. I know a lot of seed companies were going flat out. And so this is a way now that you can begin to save some of your own seeds and learn some of those skills from Chris. So Chris, with that, I would like to turn it over to you and please tell us all about it.
Sure. Well, hi everyone. I'm going to share my presentation screen here. Yeah, so this is our farm, Yonder Hill Farm. And the idea with this presentation is to give an idea of our season, of our full season of growing and preserving seeds, pretty much start to finish. So I'm going to try to kind of cover a lot of things broadly. If people have any questions as I'm going through the slides to kind of give a little more depth on anything, you're welcome to type it into the chat box and I'll keep an eye on that. Otherwise, you can hold questions to the end when we can actually have a dialogue. So I guess I'll just go ahead and get started. Let's see here. So at our farm, like you said, we produce over 150 varieties of vegetable, herbs, flowers, and grains. We also produce garlic, herbs, fruits, and nuts that we're planting, always more. We're looking at creating a fairly self-sufficient system at our farm with lots of nuts and orchards, as well as our annual vegetable patch. Oops. So yeah, so the springtime is where I'm going to start our year. And maintaining seeds takes a lot of preseason planning. There's different things to keep in mind with your garden. And a few of these bullet points I'm going to outline in the following slides. One is the importance of garden layout, how you lay out your garden for seeds as opposed to just growing for food. And that includes labeling. We'll get into that as well. Seed crops often need more space in the garden and a longer time in the garden than the same crop would need for eating. We also need to rotate which varieties we can grow each year. So there's kind of a more than just one season's worth of planning. We're always planning a few seasons ahead. And I'll get into that as well. So in terms of garden layout and labeling, this is a picture of part of our garden in the springtime. And we have beds where we planted peas. And we tend to space our pea beds with something else in the next bed adjacent so that we don't have peas growing right next to each other, different varieties growing right next to each other. You'll also see in the ground, we have our labels. This is our favorite way to make garden labels. They're actually cedar shingles that you can buy by the bundle and cut them easily with a knife and trim them and write with a permanent marker, and they last for years and years. And these labels stay with our seed crop. So we put them in when we plant the seeds, and when we're harvesting our seed crop, the label comes out of the ground, goes with the seed crop. And then once we've cleaned the seed, we don't need the label anymore, but it's important to always have the labeling following the seed crop. Different types of peas, different types of tomatoes, all the seeds tend to look similar in the end. And so it's really important to keep things distinct. Going back to the layout, this next slide demonstrates why we need to keep the pea beds separate. These are two beds next to each other. One on the right has peas, and the next one has some small grains, some spelt and oats, and barley that we were trialing. And then the next bed over, that you can just see a little bit of it, has peas again. If we had planted both of these beds with peas, they would be crawling and twining into each other and getting mixed up. So we need to prevent accidental mixing of the different types of seed in our garden. We also space within a bed if we've planted a whole section of one type of pea and we have another variety to plant, I'll put something else for about 6 to 10 feet to physically separate those two varieties of peas to prevent them from mixing with each other, because dry pea plants all end up looking very similar. Here's a picture of our greenhouse a few years ago. where we're growing different types of lettuce, as you can see. And some other seed crops also. There's actually cabbage, the tall one with the yellow flowers on the right. And we also have some beets towards the back. But this is demonstrating how the seed crops will end up being in the ground much longer. So these lettuce are not very far away from the point at which you'd like to harvest the lettuce to eat. And we do in fact go in and thin the lettuce, and we get to eat lots from our seed garden as well. This is a view of it a few months later. The lettuce has all gone to flower. You can also see there's some basil in the right blooming as well. So these actually, the lettuce becomes a full season crop in the garden. I still actually have my lettuce standing in the greenhouse. I'll be harvesting it later this week. So we started the seedlings, the lettuce seedlings in April. So it's been a full season crop, whereas for eating, you're going to be planting it and harvesting it within a few months. So one of the reasons I like to grow the lettuce in the greenhouse for seed is that the lettuce in particular the seed ripens very unevenly on the plant. So as you can see in this photo, there's some little white spots on the red lettuce, and that's the flower, the seeds that are ready to harvest, but they're still even sending new blooms. And so by being in the greenhouse, I can just leave the lettuce until most of the seeds are ready and harvest the whole thing at once. When you're growing lettuce outdoors for seed, you have to either harvest early to catch the first seeds that mature and you lose the later seeds, or you have to go and sort of hand pick the seed heads off of the plant, which is very tedious for us to do. At a home scale, it can certainly be worthwhile doing that. But if you just leave the lettuce plants, the seeds will get blown away by the wind or washed off by the rain, and you'll lose your seed, and they'll plant themselves there. So you'll get self-seeded lettuce, but you won't get to collect the seed as well. So one of the reasons that also the seeds can be taking a lot longer in the ground is that some seed crops need actually 2 years to produce seeds. What you do is in the first year, you're growing out your large population. And you do need a large population to start with so that you can select the very best to then save seed from. Those best plants you overwinter, which usually involves digging them up, storing them in a root cellar or cold storage, and then replanting them in the spring. And the plants will flower and produce seeds in the second year. And these include most root crops that we eat, like carrots and beets, turnips, leeks and onions, parsnips. There are a number of greens that are biennial, like kale and cabbage, chard, and celery. And then also some herbs and flowers. We do parsley, for example, at the farm. So some of these biennials do successfully overwinter in the garden. The main one that most people are probably aware of is parsnips and kale. Some varieties of kale are very hardy and will winter over. Parsley and leeks I find a little bit less reliable. Some winters when we have a mild winter, they will overwinter just fine. Other times when we have a harder winter or a lot of freeze-thaw cycles throughout the winter, that really takes its toll, and fewer of them will overwinter. So pretty much the only ones that we'll leave in the ground to overwinter are parsnips and kale. We dig our leeks and we bring them into the into the greenhouse, and we store them over the winter in the greenhouse. They do, as long as they don't have all the snow and the freeze-thaw, the wetness, they seem to overwinter just fine. So we move them into our greenhouse. We also move kale into our greenhouse as it's just a little bit more reliable for some of our varieties of kale to overwinter. The parsley we also do in the greenhouse. So by having an unheated hoop house, you can overwinter a lot of the biennials that are a little bit more finicky with overwintering. But pretty much all the other ones, we actually dig, we sort through them in October, usually end of October. It's not quite on our to-do list yet. And we store them in a cold storage through the winter. And that includes things like chard and celery. We actually dig the roots and we treat them as if they were a root crop and store them over. And then we plant them back out in the spring in April usually, and allow them to go through, finish their life cycle and go to seed the following year. So speaking of the Tanque Island cabbage, I wanted to give a little snapshot of the process for that one, because it's a little bit even more involved than something like carrots and beets that you harvest sort of normally, as if you were going to eat them, but then you just store them all winter and plant them back out instead of eating them. So for the Tanque Island cabbage, the first year, we grow them as seedlings, starting the seeds usually in mid-April. And then we actually partner with a market garden, Pleasant Hill Farm, there in Pleasant River in Queens County. They're good friends of ours, and they're very interested in helping us to bring this variety back, because it's quite a rare variety, and we're trying to get more seed produced and more seed out there in the world. And so the second picture is of, they're beautiful, they're very good at growing cabbage over there. And so these are some beautiful Tanque Island cabbage plants just before they're ready to harvest for their heads. They grow out hundreds and hundreds of the cabbage for us. And then they actually, one really great thing about doing the cabbage in this way is they actually get to sell the heads of cabbage. So the third picture is a view last year of Garrett there, my partner, pulling the outer leaves off of the cabbage plants, and we're cutting the heads for Cindy and David at Pleasant Hill Farm to sell then at the Lunenburg market. My daughter Ruth's down there also helping. And once the head is cut off and the outer leaves are taken off, the fourth picture is the totes full of cabbage plants ready to spend their winter in cold storage. So we pack them very tightly in a Tupperware tote with some holes drilled in it. I actually brought the tote home and watered it as if they were needing to be watered in like any other transplant. And then I left the lid off until I saw that the stem was really nice and scabbed over and dry. And then towards November, when it started getting cold in our barn, we put the lid on, and Cindy and David at Pleasant Hill Farm let us use their cold storage for us to winter over a lot of things. A root cellar is on the list to build at our farm, but we still haven't done that yet, and they've been helping us to overwinter our biennials. So I took the tote over to their place. And then the upper right-hand picture here is what those same cabbage plants looked like in April. They were nicely wintered over, and you can see that the secondary buds are starting to sprout. And basically everywhere that there was a big leaf on the cabbage stem is where a new bud grows. So we planted them into our garden. The next photo is showing those sprouts. I believe that was around early June or so, sprouting nicely. The next picture is of them blooming, and they have nice big yellow blooms, very similar to kale flowers. And I was excited to see actually some hummingbirds visiting them this summer. And then the final picture is showing the seeds starting to dry down on the plants. We wait until the seeds are, at least the seed pods are yellow, turning brown before we bring them in for harvest. So it's quite a process to produce biennial seed. Let's see. So part of rotating what we grow every year has to do with how different crops are pollinated. So some crops are what they call self-pollinating, and this includes lettuce, peas, beans, tomatoes, and peppers. And of these crops, it's a lot easier to grow however many varieties you'd like each year, because each variety will stay distinct. You can grow multiple varieties at a time, and there is minimal crossing. So what I will mention about these self-pollinating crops is that they're self-pollinating, and that means they're capable of self-pollinating, but it doesn't mean they only self-pollinate. These crops tend not to produce as much nectar. They're not as enticing to bees. So if a bee has an option between going and visiting lettuce or beans or tomatoes, they will usually opt for something else. But if you have what's called high pollinator pressure, meaning there is a lot less forage for the bees in your location than there are bees, they will end up going for your self-pollinating crops instead. So it can be an issue. In our area, I haven't heard of many people having issues. The example that I'll give is I have a friend in Prince Edward Island who is a seed grower, and she has a small, about an acre, between an acre and 2 acres, organic mixed vegetable farm, and she's surrounded by potato fields, and her neighbor decided to buy 10 honeybee hives. So if you can imagine, there was really nowhere for those bees to go except to her garden. And as soon as her neighbor got honeybees, she started seeing huge crossings happening in her beans and her lettuce and all of her self-pollinating crops, because the honeybees literally had nowhere else to go. They were hungry, and so they went for those crops. So she actually has to treat the self-pollinating crops the same way that she does the cross-pollinating crops. So it's just something to be aware of. At our farm, we have a really wonderful population of honeybees and other native, or sorry, not honeybees, bumblebees and other native pollinators. And they also have a lot to choose from. We have a lot of kind of fallow ground, a lot of pasture for them that they will go to. We also plant a lot of flowers for them. So we have found very minimal crossing in all of our self-pollinating crops. The main issue for us, as I mentioned before, is making sure that we don't accidentally mix the seeds. As long as we plant things like the peas, the climbing peas or pole beans, as long as we separate them enough that they can't twine into each other, we get good results with growing lots of different varieties in the same year. So we'll just we plan our self-pollinating crops based on, what we need to grow, and we can do lots of tomato varieties every year, different lettuce varieties, etc. The other type of pollination they call cross-pollinating crops, and these are crops that need to cross-pollinate. They cannot self-pollinate, and that's most everything. And so in order to produce seeds that are what they call true to type, meaning that you have a variety and you plant the seeds and you want to save the seeds and you want the seeds to be the same as what you had planted to begin with, you have to make sure that they can't cross with any other member of that species. So it gets a little bit complicated. You have to make sure that you're sufficiently isolated from other gardens that might be growing the same variety, or the same species, I should say. So, for example, we grow one variety of cucumber every year, and we rotate between 3 or 4 varieties because cucumber seeds last for quite a while. They last very well for many years. So we grow one variety one year and then another the next, and so on. Some things you can get away with doing 2 varieties of a species without them crossing. And the way that you do that is making sure they don't bloom at the same time. So for example, our corn, we'll often try to get 2 varieties of corn within a single growing season by planting one earlier and planting another one a little bit later, so that they're not actually blooming at the same exact moment. So that's where it gets a little bit complicated, coordinating what are you growing in your garden, knowing the species and what can cross with each other can get to be important as well. So for example, different kinds of cucumber, different varieties will cross with each other. Different varieties of watermelon will cross. Different varieties of melon, which is cantaloupe and muskmelon, they're the same species. So you have to kind of get to know what the species are that you're growing. So if you're not wanting to only grow 1 or 2 varieties of a type of species, then that's where you get into hand pollinating. And that's something we do with our squash. So this is our squash patch. And we lay it out in such a way that I can sort of arrange the vines within a variety to keep all the varieties from intertwining their vines together. So I have hills planted and I cluster them as the same, like keeping the same variety next to each other. This one also, we've developed a method of using a cover crop before we plant our squash of oats and peas. And then we cut it down. Sometimes we wait until the plants are tall, like in this photo, and we cut down the cover crop around them. And that gives a really nice mulch for the vines to grow over. It enriches the soil for them as well. And I also find it makes a nice sort of soft surface for the squash itself to lay on, so it's not coming in direct contact with the soil. Sometimes that can allow pesky insects to kind of get into your squash if they're laying right on the soil. So squash is a really nice one for hand pollinating. It's the only one that we do hand pollinate because the flowers are so big. And squash plants produce both male flowers and female flowers. So the upper left-hand photo is a female blossom that's open and ready and receptive. The picture on the top right is the spent insides of the male flower. I stripped the petals off in order to do the hand pollinating. But you can see that the insides of the flowers look quite different. Both male and female squash blossoms are only open and receptive for 1 day, actually only for 1 morning. So you have 1 morning to pollinate each female flower. So you sort of have to go out and watch your squash patch a lot. I'm in the squash patch every evening and every morning for about a month or a month and a half between the end of July and early September doing hand pollinating. So the basic process is in the evenings, you go and you see which blooms are going to open the next morning. They can be quite distinctive because the flower petals are still firm, but they're brightly yellow and they're not quite open yet. The flowers that had been open already they're wilting and dying. The petals are soft and mushy. And then the flowers that are not going to open the next morning are still very, very firm and they're still green usually. So you kind of get the hang of getting a sense for when the flowers are going to open just by experience. So I go out in the evening and I scope out first. I look for female flowers that are going to open the next morning. If there's no female flowers, if I can't find any, then I move on to the next variety because you need to have the female flower because the female flower turns into the squash, which produces the seeds. And the squash plants, they make both male and female flowers on the same plant, and they make way more male flowers than they do female flowers. It's a lot less energy for the plant to pump out male blooms because they just live for one day and then fall off. Whereas the female flower is a lot more energy for the plant. It has to make all of the parts that are going to turn into a squash and are going to produce the seeds. And producing seeds takes a lot of energy for plants, a lot of extra nutrients from the soil and stuff. So if there's any stress on the squash plant, they'll often drop female flowers. If they, if there's a dry spell, or if they're not in very rich soil, they won't produce as much. So I find the female flowers in the evening, and I tape them shut. I actually use painter's tape, and you can kind of see that in the last photo. I don't have any pictures of them taped shut. I should add that to my repertoire of photos sometime. But yeah, I tape the female flower shut so that it can't open and so that the bees can't get in, because the bees will move pollen between the varieties and cross the squash. And the flowers open at the first ray of sun in the morning, so it's important to tape them shut the evening before. So for every female flower that I tape shut, I try to tape about 5 male blooms shut. Partly this is insurance that if sometimes insects will chew holes in the petals to get in, to get the nectar from the male flowers. So if I see something like that has happened, I just toss the flower. And then I also like to have mixed genetics within each female flower to create the seeds so that I have more genetic diversity. So yeah, I tape about five male blooms for every female. And I, yeah, in the morning, I go out and I pick the male flowers from their stems. The third photo down on the bottom right is showing me actually doing the hand pollinating. So I pick the male flowers, I strip the petals off, and I paint the pollen onto the female flower. I open the female flower last, just to make sure that I have it open for the least amount of time, because at this time of the morning, I go out usually shortly after sunrise. The whole squash patch is just buzzing with bumblebees. So they are very interested in what I'm doing. And I actually find when I throw down the male flowers after using the pollen, they go right for them, because then they get the nectar straight out of the male blossoms. So they start to follow me around the squash patch, and I have to be careful that they're not going to fly into the female blooms. So I have to work fast. So I get the female flower part covered with pollen from the male, and then I tape the female blossom shut. And that's to prevent any bees from getting in after I've finished my hand pollination. You can see that in the last photo. That's a female flower that I've taped shut. And there's a squash that's going to grow. That one is a acorn squash, one of our varieties. I tape a little bit of marking tape around or tie some marking tape around the stem of the squash to identify it at harvest time. And that way I know when it's harvest time which fruits I've hand pollinated, because I never am able to hand pollinate all of the fruits. The ones that don't get hand pollinated are for us to eat, or sometimes I sell those at markets if I have a lot of extras. And then I save the squash fruits that I have saved for seed, and you'll see them again at when we hit the fall. So now getting into summertime, it's pollination season. So there's probably the most of the types of crops that we grow are insect pollinated. And I think being a seed farm, we really help the local pollinators out a lot. We have lots of different types The top left photo is carrots in our greenhouse. They resemble very much Queen Anne's lace, which is also known as wild carrot, and it's actually the exact same species as our domesticated carrots that we eat as vegetables. And I actually learned fairly recently that Queen Anne's lace, as we call it, as a wildflower, is not native to North America. It's from Eurasia. And the types of Queen Anne's lace that we have growing in North America actually predominantly came as carrots, and they became sort of wild and naturalized. So they will readily cross with our carrots that we're saving for seed. And so our strategy at our farm to produce good carrot seed is that we plant the carrots after we've overwintered them. We plant them a little bit earlier in March in our unheated hoop house and water them in well, and they get growing much earlier than the Queen Anne's lace that's present in our fields growing wild. And so they actually get quite a head start on the Queen Anne's lace, and they grow and start to produce their flowers but about a month before the Queen Anne's lace starts to bloom. So in that way, we're able to minimize crossing. One of the benefits of if there is a cross, it will have a white root. So we can always catch the crosses when we plant the next year's carrot seed. And I find I have less than 5% crossing in our carrot seed with the Queen Anne's lace, which I find pretty standard that there's in terms of the seed world. When you buy commercial seeds, there's often some variation anyway, and so a 5% off type is pretty good. So that's how we're able to produce carrot seed here, is by getting it blooming before the Queen Anne's lace. The next photo to the right is leeks. You can see that there's a few different types of insects enjoying those. And we have calendula, the orange calendula that we grow. We just grow one variety of calendula because, again, different varieties will cross as they're the same species. And this is my personal favorite one for making medicinal salves. It has a high resin content and a lovely orange color, so it's the only one that I grow. And then we have Tithonia, which is also known as Mexican sunflower, on the bottom left-hand corner. Just a few examples, but most of the seed crops that we grow are insect pollinated. There are a few that are pollinated by the wind. The one on the left is our golden chard. And it's a variety of Swiss chard that has nice, very vibrantly golden stems, my personal favorite. And chard is actually the same species as beets. So we alternate which we're growing out for seed. Of course, we can grow both as first-year plants every year because they're not blooming until their second year. So we just make sure that there's only one or the other blooming each year. So we have one variety of chard, the golden chard, and we currently have one variety of beets that we do, which is called Lutz green leaf beet. It's a lovely storage beet. So in order to, increase our selection of varieties that we can offer, we have to work out the rotation to be growing them out at different years. So it gets a little bit complicated. And being wind pollinated, wind can make the pollen travel quite widely, a lot farther than insects like bees typically will fly. So the isolation distance is actually a lot bigger for wind pollinated crops in general. The photo on the right is actually spinach going to seed. Some people might recognize that from their gardens when your spinach gets a little bit past you. And you can see that spinach is a little bit unique because there aren't a lot of types of vegetables that, or garden plants in general, that are either male or female. So a spinach plant is either a female or a male. So you have to let both of them grow in order to get a seed crop, but the seeds will only be produced on the female plants. So you can see in this photo, kind of on the right side, there's a more spindly looking spinach plant with a different looking top, and that's actually the male spinach plant. On the right hand side, you can see a few female spinach plants growing, and they make their flowers at the junction of the leaf and the stem. Spinach is easier to grow more than one variety in a season because they have a very short window where they're actually blooming. They, as many people know from growing spinach, they bolt very quickly, and they bloom and then they're done. So they have a very short life cycle. So we do grow, this year we grew both of our varieties of spinach. Often I will alternate them, grow one year, one another year, just for simplicity's sake. But this year we had such a big interest in our seeds in the spring that I found that I needed to grow both of my varieties of spinach out. So I had one variety in our hoop house, and that I planted in March or April in the hoop house. And then I planted actually some outdoors at the end of April, early May. And so they bloomed at different times. And that was how I was able to get two varieties in one season. So getting on towards the end of summer, after we've taken care of our crops, planted them, spaced them well, labeled them well, weeded, done all the maintenance that you would do normally, we start to see the fruits of our labors coming on to harvest time. In the late summer, the first things that dry down are the peas. And as you can see in the photo, these peas are ready to harvest. As things start drying down in the field, I start watching the weather forecast, because when the peas are at this stage, if we had a prolonged bit of rain, which seems uncommon these days with our dry summers, but if it were to come along, or if there was a hurricane or something, then I would want to get these peas in, because when the plants are getting crispy dry, a little bit of moisture hitting the pods can actually make them spring open and drop their seeds. So you do have to start watching carefully. You'll find that all of the seed crops will go from green to yellow to brown pretty quickly. It can just be within a week or 2 weeks. So you do need to keep an eye once you see that the seeds are fully developed. Start taking walks around your garden and watching for them to be ready to bring in. Once the plants and the seed pods have turned yellow, you can actually cut them to bring them indoors. They will complete their drying indoors as long as you lay them out or hang them in a well-ventilated space and there's lots of air movement. Once the seed pods start to turn yellow, that's indicating that all that's happening from this point forward is drying down. And so that can happen outdoors, or it can happen indoors, and we use our barn for that. So on the upper right hand, that's actually our picture of carrot seed that's ready to harvest and bring in, and parsnip seed is on the bottom right. So definitely most of our seed crops are dry coming in from the field, but we do have some that are wet, such as tomatoes. So wet seed crops are handled in a different way than the dry, because they have to get processed from their juicy fruits. And this is a picture of our station for saving tomato seeds. I'd like to point out all the labeling. So I label the jars and the containers that I'm doing the processing in. And those pieces of tape with the name go on with the seeds as far as they go. So with tomatoes, being a really juicy fruit, they actually need to undergo a fermentation. I've heard of people getting away without doing this step, but the fermentation does a few things. One thing is it breaks disease cycles. There's a number of diseases that get destroyed through proper fermentation, such as the blights that can affect tomatoes. And it also improves germination rates because the tomato seed is surrounded by a sac of germination inhibiting enzymes. So by fermenting those juices down, you're breaking down the inhibitors for germination. And then you actually get better germination rates and better storage rates for your tomato seeds. So you basically scoop the guts of the tomatoes into a container. You only want to make it at the most half full of tomato guts. And then you put it in a spot to ferment for 3 to 5 days. You need to make sure not to leave them too long or they actually will start to start to sprout right in the containers. So between the 3 to 5 day mark is about the window that I look for. Once the fermentation has happened and there's a nice skim of mold, you stir the gunk really vigorously to kind of break up any chunks. Then you add water to the top of the container and you let the seeds settle. The good seeds will sink. Any seeds that are floating are not good seeds. And a lot of the gunk will all float as well. So you pour that off and you keep pour off the water and the gunk and you keep adding water and you kind of are rinsing and washing the seeds. And then once you've got pretty clear water and your good seeds at the bottom, then you put it into a sieve or a colander and rinse them really well and then put them somewhere to dry. I recommend using a ceramic plate. I also started this year using bags that we made out of burlap because then I can actually hang them up and it takes up a lot less space for us. But then you dry them and once they're dried fully, they're ready to store. So. Another one that we have to do wet is cucumbers. So this is a picture of my daughter Ruth helping with the cucumber seed harvest. The bigger picture is a picture of the fully mature cucumbers ready for seed saving and the cucumbers that we would actually be eating. So cucumbers, when we eat them, we're eating the immature fruit. When you actually let the cucumbers go, and many of you gardeners have probably seen this happen in your garden by accident, maybe, because it can happen pretty fast that they go from a nice green cucumber to a giant yellow thing. So we let them go that far. This is our national pickling cucumber variety. And we let them go as long as possible. You almost treat them sort of like squash, where you let them go on the vine and develop as long as possible. And then you bring them in and you even let them ripen a little more. And then you cut them in half and scoop their seeds out. And the rind is technically edible, but it's not very, I don't know what people would do with them. Maybe try pickling or something. We just put them in the compost ourselves, but you pretty much lose the crop to eat when you save cucumber seeds. You scoop the cucumber seeds into a bucket, and they're also surrounded by sort of a gelatinous sac, similar to the tomatoes. So we let that ferment as well, and it bubbles up quite a bit. So you don't want to fill your containers more than half or 2/3 full. And after, again, 3 to 5 days, the fermentation is complete and you can do the same process, adding water, rinsing off the seeds and the good seeds sinking, rinsing them off and drying them on a tray. So I did want to mention we also grow a lot of garlic, and at the end of the summer is harvest time. We planted in October, so that's coming right up here. We do sell seed garlic on our website. We have a little bit left if anybody's still looking for seed garlic. And we also retail the table garlic. We have about 6 varieties that we grow in large quantity. I always like to add new ones because they're all different and we're garlic lovers. So if you're interested in any seed garlic, you can head over to our website. So heading into the fall, our spaces get pretty full of seeds. It kind of takes over. This is actually a picture just from a few weeks ago in our barn. We use a lot of sheets and pillowcases to collect our seed crops. I find that they're a pretty ideal thing to use because they contain pretty much every seed. We only have a couple of seeds that can actually get through a sheet or a pillowcase. So they contain things really well. They also allow some ventilation to come through. So it's not like with a tarp where once you wrap up a bundle of seeds in a tarp, if there's any residual moisture in there, it's not going to get out. Whereas what we tend to do is we'll bring in seed crops, lay them out on our sheets to dry more fully. And then once they're nice and crispy, we'll tie up the sheets and hang them out of the way. And as you'll see in a few slides, what we end up doing with them too. And our sun porch of our farmhouse, while our barn is filling up with dry seeds, our sun porch fills up with wet seeds. This is a view of some squash and other harvests. Currently, our sun porch, this same space, is full of peppers. We stripped our pepper plants just the other day with the chilly nights coming. So we have them full of tomatoes and peppers currently, but it changes with the seasons, and that's where we tend to do a lot of our cutting open and processing. So speaking of squash, you know, after the busy time hand pollinating in August and just letting the squash grow, once there's a frost, we collect up our squash, and I mark which ones I've hand pollinated. I tend to harvest them into separate piles, and then they actually go to different places to start with. Our seed squash I take into the greenhouse, and the upper right hand picture is actually from this year. Our squash is there in our where we usually do our germination for seedlings. And yeah, we lay them out in the greenhouse in order to speed ripen it, is what I call it. So being in the really warmth, the sun, it tends to speed up the ripening process because we need to start cutting into our squash to save the seeds by about December. We kind of want to speed up the process. Normally for eating squash, what we call our eating squash, the ones that I haven't hand pollinated, we bring those into the sun porch to start with, where they kind of get into a slower ripening process. Because when you're growing winter squash to eat and you want to have it last into January, February, even March or later, you don't necessarily want to speed harvest or speed ripen the squash. And so you sort of want a slower ripening process. The seeds actually continue to develop inside the squash fruit. So if I were to cut open our squash, a lot of our winter squash right now, a lot of the seed would shrivel right up and not be any good. And I know that from experience because sometimes a squash will start to rot at this time of year. Maybe it got a spot of mold or a blemish on it. And I tried to salvage some seeds out of it because I've hand pollinated the fruit. But when I cut it open and scoop out the seeds, they look like good seeds. I rinse them, I lay them out to dry, and they shrivel up to nothing. So we do have to be careful and try to get our squash to go kind of until about November, December, at which point I can cut it open and they're mostly all viable seeds. So part of the squash process is that further ripening of the seeds within the squash while you're storing it. And that does go for zucchinis as well. You can see in the top left-hand photo, some big old zucchinis, which have gone their full life cycle, way beyond when you would eat them at the table. And basically they're treated like winter squash. We bring them into the greenhouse and speed ripen them. They tend to be the first ones we cut open in November because they don't tend to have been bred for long storage. So they are ready a lot quicker. So I start the process of scooping out the squash seeds, which people mostly are familiar with from doing jack-o'-lanterns. It's basically cutting open the squash, scooping these seeds out, cleaning up the inside gunk off the seeds, and then rinsing them really well, and then laying them out to dry on trays. And so that's the last photo there. You can see that's what our life tends to look like. That's a little bit later in December, where we're actually drying down our squash seeds. So in the fall and early winter, which is we're deep in it right now, we are just actually cleaning a lot of seeds and using these pieces of equipment today. We start to clean our seeds. Now, for people doing home scale, you can do a lot with just stomping on your sheets full of seeds. Basically what you need to do is thresh the seeds first, and the threshing is the process of separating the seeds from the plant. So the seeds are encased in some kind of seed pod. We're talking about the dry seeds here, of course. And so you need to somehow physically remove the seeds from the pods. And it gets a little bit tiresome cracking open one pod at a time, as some of you who have probably dabbled in seed saving can attest to. So really the threshing is a real physical process. You can stomp the wooden box at one point with slats in the bottom, and so that we could put the material into the boxes and actually stomp on the plant matter in the boxes. What else have we done? You can rub things through screens. So you're actually physically, you put on a pair of nice thick leather gloves and get some hardware cloth, and you start rubbing the plant material against the screen, and that will break apart the seed pods, which will fall, the seeds will fall through the screen. So we do actually still do a mixture of those things with some of our smaller lots of seeds. But recently we upgraded to the machine on the left, which is a converted wood chipper. It's an old wood chipper, roto-hoe wood chipper. And it used to have a gasoline engine on it, but we got it and we took the gas engine off, replaced it with an electric motor. It's a 3/4 horsepower motor, and it actually slows the chipper down so that it's not going quite as fast as it would for chipping wood. So we actually feed our plant material through, and I have a video on the next slide to show you of that process. But if you get into doing any quantity of things like beans or peas, especially, it can be, and you have a handy person around, or if you're handy, it can be a great a thing to convert an old wood chipper into a thresher, because it saves a lot of time. The machine on the right is a do-it-yourself seed cleaner, which if you Google DIY seed cleaner, you'll find the open source plans for this machine. They were put out by a small seed company in the UK that designed it, and it basically mimics many tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment that larger seed companies and seed houses would use to clean their seeds. So it's a really great thing. Again, if you have someone handy that can build something like this. It works off a shop vac, as you can see, which is hooked up there. And it's basically gravity versus vacuum power. And what it does is it does the process of what's called winnowing. So after threshing, then you have to winnow your seeds. And the winnowing is separating the seeds from all the bits of what they call chaff. So all the little bits of plant material that there's a lot of dusty stuff, little bits of seed pods and stems and stuff. And so in the old days, people would actually throw baskets of seeds and chaff up into the wind and catch it. Or you can pour from one bucket into another on a windy day, and the wind will carry the chaff away and the seeds will fall because the seeds are heavier than the chaff. And so we used to do this process with the wind, but more with, we'd set up a fan because a fan is a bit more controlled and you can pour seeds from one bucket into another in front of a fan. But it gets to be quite dusty work. So, and it took quite a long time to do that. So this machine, the DIY seed cleaner, is another huge time saver for us. And we run pretty much all of our seeds through it after they've been threshed. We can even run our squash seeds through and it will clean out the duds. So there's always some seeds in our squash that the pods don't, the seed shell hasn't fully developed. And so it dries down to just kind of, I call them the duds. They have nothing in them. They just snap in half if you go to bend them. And so we'll even run our squash through this and it'll take out all of the empty shells of the seeds. And I have a video of that also. I hope the videos work. I heard that that's a little bit jumpy, but here's a video of our seed thresher, which again, actually, if you Google wood thresher, or sorry, wood chipper conversion to seed thresher or something like that, you'll find actually plans and instructions on how to do it. But here's the video. So basically, yeah, we're feeding in the beans through the top and they're getting beat up by the hammers inside the thresher. And what comes out is bits of plant and the seeds outside of their pods. So here's a video of our DIY seed cleaner. And what's going to happen is the seeds fall down through the funnel. This is a pretty short video. But I want you to sort of pay attention to what happens in this sort of empty space above the triangles, sort of the zigzag channel. The zigzag channel is there to slow the seeds down as they're falling. And the suction sucks up the lighter material, all the chaff, and they're actually in this open space above the triangles. There becomes a bit of a vortex where everything's spinning. And the chaff gets sucked through the channel to the right and then hits a little wall, which you'll see, and falls. So another nice thing about this machine is that it collects everything that is sucked up. So it doesn't actually go into the shop vac at all. You're just using the suction power of the vacuum cleaner. And it actually, you collect everything that gets sucked up. So if you accidentally suck a bunch of good seeds, because some seeds are lighter than others, you can get them back. You can collect them again. Whereas if you're using something like a fan or the wind, once it blows away, it's pretty much gone. So here's this. So yeah, so it sort of collects it all at this at the bottom here, and there's a little hatch that we take it out with. I'll just also point out the sort of the circles on the back of the machine are actually how we control the amount of suction. So for heavy seeds, we have actually a piece of plexiglass that slides in front of those holes. So when all the holes are covered, then it's on full suction. And the shop vac is at full suction, sucking through the machine. And so for heavy seeds like beans and peas, we have it on full suction. Once we start to open up some of those circles, it decreases the amount of suction because air is coming in through those holes. And we actually are able to do quite light seed. that doesn't need as much suction, or rather, if there was more suction, even the seeds would get sucked up. But that's again where it comes in handy to be able to collect what is sucked up, because if we get a bunch of good seeds accidentally into this side chamber where the chaff collects, we can actually recover them. And then I wanted to share this other video of our antique corn sheller. And this is a pretty great old hand crank unit. My daughter, at the time she was 6, and she's running the crank. And yeah, I'll show you how it works. It's a pretty great thing if you can find one of these. So it's a pretty neat thing. We looked pretty hard to find one, and it helps us go through our sort of moderate amount of corn that we do. That would be, we'd have pretty sore thumbs if we were doing it all by hand. So winter time, we're bringing our seeds in. We're weighing out how much we've grown each year and inventorying what we have to figure out what we have available to sell to everyone. We're filling packets. It's a pretty busy time, even in the winter for us. And then our seeds are ready to sell. And so here's a picture of our seed rack this past winter. I think it's from February, when we were actually out and about. Seems so long ago now. And yeah, we're dreaming of summer. I thought I'd include this it's a little panoramic of our garden this year. You can kind of get a shot of our squash patch and stuff, but it's sort of nice to look at in the winter time when everything's covered in snow. But yeah. So I hope everyone enjoyed my presentation. I know it was quite a breeze through a lot of information, but yeah, it's sort of what our life looks like as a yearly cycle for us as a family and as our farm business. So you can head over to yonderhillfarm.ca. We have a lot more pictures and information about our seeds and what we have, our varieties. I do update the website with this year's inventory. I do it in December, so I aim to have it all done by January 1st. So if you like the looks of some varieties that are sold out now, then check back first thing in January, and they should be back. We were able to grow most of our stock back from what we sold out of this year. We're also on Facebook at Yonder Hill Farm, so you can check us out there too. I do tend to make posts from time to time, updating with what's happening on the farm. So I guess I'll exit the screen share, or I think we can open up to questions if anyone has any. We can people can type things in.
So Chris, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Incredible.
Sure. Should I stop the screen share, or?
Yes, why don't you stop the screen share? And we have about 20 minutes for discussion. So if anyone has a question, come off mute and ask your question, and we can, Chris, be glad to answer your questions. Well, I can't have covered everything.
Well, I've got a question right away,
Sure.
Chris. How do you best save seed year to year?
In what way?
Well, if you have a lot of seed, you don't use it all in one year, and you want to save it for the next year,
Yes.
what's the best way?
Yeah, so storage. Well, sort of the 3 parameters, probably in order of importance, is dry, cool, and dark. So the dryness is the most important thing. If your seeds are getting any moisture, they'll, even atmospheric moisture, they'll take that in. And this is actually another reason it's really important to separate the seeds from the chaff, because the chaff absorbs moisture really readily. So if you have your seeds still mixed up with a bunch of bits of plant matter and they seem really dry, well, that plant matter is going to be like taking in whatever atmospheric humidity there is, and can cause issues with your seeds. So it is good to clean your seeds as best you can. Get them really dry. What I do at this time of year when we are cleaning our seeds, I know that they can't be 100% dry because the moisture in the air is shifting. In the fall, it tends to get more humid. So I'll put them in a container, even though they feel really dry. I know that they're not as dry as they could be. So I don't seal the container. If I put them in a jar, I leave the lid off just to allow the moisture to kind of escape. If I actually use freezer bags for a lot of seed storage. I find that they're durable enough, more so than like sandwich baggies. And so the freezer bags, I'll put the seeds in there, and then I'll sort of prop them up in a box and leave the top of the bag unzipped to allow the moisture to escape. By this point, they're already dry enough that they're not going to like just totally rot. But you just have to realize that the seeds will take on moisture from the general air. By the time it gets to be December and January, we're running our wood stove, and so our house is quite a bit dry in the air. It's also drier just in general outdoors as well, the humidity. And so I wait until kind of when I know the seeds have been in a very dry setting for a long time, and then I seal them up and put them into long-term storage. And that seems to work really well. I have heard of people incorporating things like silica packets that tend to wick moisture away from things, or putting rice in, something else that will absorb the moisture away from the seeds. I haven't really done a lot of that myself, but we keep all of our seeds in a tote in our spare bedroom of our farmhouse, which tends to be quite cool because we don't always keep it very heated. So yeah, we find our seeds last quite well in that setting. When you start with fresh seeds, they last a long time. So depending on the type of vegetable, I should add, because some types of vegetables, their seeds just don't last. Things like parsnips are notoriously short-lived seeds. They'll go for maybe a year or two at best, even if you have them stored really well. Leeks and onions are a little bit shorter lived. They'll be, 2 to 4 years for those. But most of your other types of seeds, the squash, the cucumber, tomatoes, and peppers, they can be stored for 5+ years, just in the way that I have described. So I see I do have a question about what we do with our grains. Well, we've been, we're very interested in producing small scale grains for our own use and then to sell as seeds. So we've been trialing different varieties of grains that will be easy to work with by hand. Because one thing to know is that a lot of commercial varieties of grain are bred to be harvested with machines. So they have a really hard seed coat, and they're difficult to thresh they're difficult to thresh by hand, I should say. So we look for types of grains that they call hull-less, which just means they don't have that hard seed coat on them. And it makes them easier to process at home. Because you can thresh them more easily, and then they're ready. As soon as you thresh and winnow them, they're ready to eat. There's no other process of removing a seed hull. So we're sort of working our way up with a few things that we've liked the results from. We've done a few hulless barley. This year we grew out our hulless oats. I'm hoping to be able to offer some of those for sale this year. But basically we do what's called bulking up. So you start with a small amount of seed and you grow it out and see how it does. And if you like it and you save the seed, you then save pretty much all of it to plant again the next year. And then you kind of keep doing that process where you keep getting more and more seed. And after a few years, you have, you know, a lot of seed for eating or for planting large amounts. So we actually, for threshing, the threshing machine that I showed you is excellent for the grains. We cut our grains when they're yellow, turning brown, and then dry them in the barn. And then when they're dry, we don't actually have to feed the whole plant through the threshing machine. We can hold it very tightly in bundles and just stick the end in where the seed heads are. And that thresher that you saw running will actually knock all of the grains off the stalk. And it does, yeah, it knocks them out, and then the seed cleaner does a really great job. It's pretty easy to clean them up. And so we haven't gotten to do a lot in the kitchen yet, other than just sort of sample them. I'm hoping to do more taste testing of the oats that we have this year. But we've been focusing more on what grows well for us and trying to bulk those varieties up, and then we'll start looking at yeah, which ones are good in the kitchen. So I hope that answers your question.
Hi, Chris. I have a question.
Yeah.
It's Claudia, and you were actually going to be at our St. Margaret's Bay Garden Club Transition Bay CD7. So we'll eventually, we're still hopeful. First of all, I want to say I'm incredibly grateful for, you know, people are out there growing and saving seed, because we as vegetable gardeners really benefit from all your hard work. And it was really neat.
And it is hard work.
And it is hard work. So we're incredibly grateful, and we've had great success with all your seeds. And so I'm curious about, how did you find this passion?
Well, I think when I was first getting into farming, I was always really interested in the idea of sustainability. That was sort of a buzzword in the early 2000s when I was finishing university. And to me, sustainable farming includes seed saving, because it's the link, you know, I mean, you can, it's the link for food security, for local food security, because you can have lots of people, home gardeners, market gardeners, that are really great at growing food, but if they're relying on a globalized system for the seeds, then it's not a sustainable system. So I was really keen to incorporate seed growing, and I was just very interested in it. And I think I also found that I have a real affinity and interest for plant propagation in general. So things like seed saving and grafting and things like that. So it's something that I really enjoy doing. So the sort of, I guess, the interest up here of like, oh, sustainability, and it's so important, but then also just something that I found that I really enjoyed. And I have to say that I was always keen. I spent about 10 years working at different farms and gardens, and I was always interested in the seed saving process, and would try to do some here and there. And then when I actually moved to Nova Scotia, I was connected with Owen Bridge, who has Annapolis Seeds. Yeah. And I actually worked, I was a garden manager at Windhorse Farm in 2009, and that was his second year of business. Mm-hmm. And they had connected the year prior, where Windhorse Farm was growing seeds for him to sell. And so when I was garden manager, I got hooked up with Owen and was instructed, part of your job is to grow out seeds to sell to Owen. And so I sort of fell into it that way. I went on in the few other years before we bought our farm where we are now. I was growing gardens, seed gardens, and selling to Owen prior to that. So I sort of fell into it as a business, I'd say, but the passion has been there before that for sure. So we just sort of grown from there, and Owen's great, and we have a really good relationship to this day. And we do still sell seeds to him when we have extra. And yeah, we're all on the same team, trying to help people learn how to save seeds. Yeah.
I have a question about pepper seeds.
Yeah.
You treat them like tomatoes, like wet?
It's sort of like a in between wet and dry. So we're in the process of doing our peppers right now. I mean, the first thing with any fruit really is you want them to ripen as much as possible on the plants, at least to the point that they're turning color. I'm experimenting a little bit this year with how green I can save seeds from a pepper, because we had an amazing pepper year. So when we stripped our pepper plants, I pulled aside peppers that were just starting to turn color. Normally I like to let them go full color on the plant. But I just wanted to sort of experiment, like, where's the line between when you can save the seed and when you can't. So I pull them in, and I still let them ripen more indoors. And then the thing about peppers that I do, I know that there's probably a lot of different ways to do it, but what I found works really nicely, that I actually get to eat the pepper too, is I cut open the pepper carefully, and I preserve the sort of the top of the pepper where the seeds are all sort of stuck to the inside, right? And I cut that off, and I lay it on a plate, it's sort of in the sunshine. It's good if it dries quickly. And the idea with that is that the pepper seeds, like sort of the more natural pepper plant, like the ancestral pepper plant, would have dried really well. So you think of things like cayenne pepper and some other hot peppers that really actually, to save the seed, you just dry the pepper, and then you can break it apart by hand, you wearing gloves and in a well-ventilated area. But yeah, those are sort of the easiest ones to save from. And it's like the pepper, we've domesticated it to become this kind of juicy thing that doesn't dry very well. If you just leave a pepper there, it'll rot and turn gushy. So you by cutting the juicy flesh away from the core of the pepper, it allows the pepper seeds to dry down while still connected to the core of the pepper. And that is supposed to help improve germination and viability. There's actually, I made a recent Facebook post showing a picture, I believe, of our peppers, seeds drying. So that's what I do.
Like the cayenne and the hot peppers, you can just let the whole pepper dry? Because I didn't have any luck with, I tried that with Hungarian hot wax.
Yeah, that one I find doesn't dry well.
Okay, and the seeds just didn't germinate, like nothing, nada.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's one that I put on gloves, and I cut them open to take off the flesh and just leave the stem. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna try that. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. There's another question here I see in the chat. I don't know the full question. Can a person save any seeds from the garden in the same way you described? I've been holding off cutting some plants until I took part in this workshop. I see. Certainly, I encourage people to try seed saving, because the worst that's going to happen is you're going to learn a lot. So, I mean, I remember the very first year, I was actually still in university, and I had a spinach plant go to bolt, go to flower. And I tried saving seeds from it, and it turned out to be a male, and that's how I learned about male spinach plants and female spinach plants. So I feel like there's always going to be a learning curve, and the way that you get on it is just to try. So if you have plants that have gone to seed in your garden right now, it's great if you want to cut them and just bring them in and see what happens, plant them, see what you get next year. even if you get some kind of cross, chances are you'll be able to eat it, if not anything else. So certainly I encourage people to just have a go.
Kind of like compost squash.
And Chris,
Yeah.
Joanna has a question. Is there a simple way to identify male versus female squash blossoms?
Oh, yes. Oh, so the simplest way is to look at the base of the flower. So where the petals join to the stem. Male squash blossoms just have a stem.
No.
Female squash blossoms have a little baby squash there. So whatever type of squash you're growing, if you're growing a zucchini, the female zucchini blossom, even before it's opened, has a little baby zucchini on it. If it's an acorn, then it's a little baby acorn squash. So you just really, you look at the base of the flower, and if it's just a straight stem coming out of the petals, then that's a male. Yeah. That's the easiest way. Yeah.
I have a comment. I mean, two of my favorite plants to let go are lamb's quarter and mustard, and because they're so early, and I love eating lamb's quarter and mustard, and also I love letting the lamb's quarter grow so that it attracts the aphids away from other plants, because they preferentially climb onto the lamb's quarter. So to me, it's really worthwhile leaving a few lamb's quarters, even when they're well past eating time. And mustard is so easy. You almost have to fight it back to not have good seed. But I was really interested when you said that some of the stuff you're overwintering in a root cellar. I didn't know anything about that. And I'm right in the middle of building a root cellar in my basement. I imagine I can just Google that and find out more, huh?
Yeah, I mean, you basically, you're going to store the roots the same way you would as if you were storing them to eat. So same kind of temperature, same humidity. I find because you're trying to store them all the way until March or April, you really need to make sure, especially that the temperature is cool enough, because if you're storing them where the temperature is a little bit warm, even just a few degrees too warm, they'll start to sprout too early, in January or February. And you don't want that to happen, because you don't want them sprouting until closer to when you're ready to plant them. So I'd say you have to be a little bit more careful about your storage conditions for storing crops for the biennials for seed. And definitely we went through quite a learning curve with the cabbage. Previous to this year's grow out, which was successful, we had a dismal failure overwintering the stems, where I let them get too moist and then too dry. So figuring out a system where you're keeping the temperature and the moisture kind of just right, it's a learning process for sure.
Well, we're also glad you're working on the Tanque cabbages for sure. Our next presentation is going to be with Phil Moskovitz, and it's Bubbles and Brine, all about fermentation processes. And he's, I know his book has you in it, his Bubbles and Brine book, and he's going to show a little demonstration of how to make a little quart of sauerkraut, which of course can scale up.
Great.
So I wish we all had a Tanque cabbage to work on.
Well, they're being sold at the Lunenburg market right now, so you could actually go get one. I was just over this weekend at Cindy and David's, and we were doing the first harvesting of their grow out this year of the cabbage. So go get one on Thursday.
Oh, it's Thursday?
Yeah, they're on the pre-order. So actually you have to pre-order them on their, on the Lunenburg market website. And then the pickup's on Thursday at the market. Yeah.
So David, maybe you could announce that fermentation workshop.
Yes, it's October 29th. It's going to be right here on Zoom again. The same deal. It's free. Donations are appreciated, but not necessary. which you can also add donations here if you want to. And Phil Moskowitz has a wonderful book. It's so fun. It just reads like a book of his stories of connecting with different masters of fermentation. So he starts out with this with the good standards, like making Tanque sauerkraut, and but goes on to meat fermentation and many other things, beers, wines, on and on. Every kind of fermentation you can do. Celebrates Nova Scotians master fermenters. So we're really happy to have him. And Phil lives right here in St. Margaret's Bay too. He's an old time friend of mine. So this is going to be a lot of fun, and it's a good chance to see him make a jar of sauerkraut and make some yourself too. So please everyone register for it and keep in touch for other things. Like early in the spring or late winter, we're going to have a program on growing undercover. All the different ways that you can cover your crops, from greenhouses to floating row cover to hoop row tunnels, and on and on and on. We don't have a date yet for that, but we will have it. So that's something else, and there'll probably be something else in November, which we'll be planning in the next few weeks.
That's great. Thank you, David. And Chris, I think all very much want to thank you for the generous amount of time, incredible slides. You know, we get to walk through your farm and see how everything is done. It's a lot more complicated, a lot more work than I would have thought, because it's all case by case for each type of crop. It's pretty amazing. Yeah. And
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great.
Exactly.
You did an amazing job of making it sound really clear and understandable. Best I've seen yet on seed saving. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Great.
And thank you everyone for joining.
Bye.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, David.
Yes.
All
You're
good.
welcome. Thank you.
Everyone come back and tell your friends that you can come back and